acknowledge that I'm talking today from the traditional lands of the Narragansett people and acknowledge elders past, present and future. And thanks so much to CSI for hosting these fantastic summits and conversations. They've been very stimulating and I've enjoyed the ones that I've participated in. I encourage you to join others as well. As Rhonda said, my name's Doug Taylor. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Uniting here in New South Wales, and also work in the ACT and sit on a number of boards and advisory groups as well. And welcome, Michael, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Doug. Lovely to be online with you.
Great. Looking forward to a great conversation. I'm just going to do a quick bio. I won't read the book. I'll do a very quick bio, and then we'll go to some questions and conversation. I think it's going to be a great conversation today. Michael is well known to most of us, or many of us, as the founding Chief Executive of Social Ventures Australia, where I got to know Michael in the early years of him forming that organisation. And prior to that, he was with Macquarie Bank for 15 years and as Executive Director of the private equity arm of the organisation, Macquarie Direct Investment. In the middle of all this, Michael, as he described it, decided to jump ship and make a transition into the social purpose sector. And that's captured beautifully in the book that he's written, Jumping Ship, for which he won the Ashurst Business Literature Award. Today, Michael sits on a range of mostly social purpose related boards, Chair of Good Start Early Learning, Chair of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, Executive Director of For Purpose Investments, and Australian Philanthropic Services. There's a long list of others. I won't go through all of them. You can read online about that, but he's very engaged in a range of organisations, including the Centre for Social Impact, where he's an adjunct professor and also on the advisory board. And I guess the first question for you, Michael, is do you ever sleep? Given the range of things that you're engaged in, you're clearly very busy. Today in the conversation, we'll be covering a whole range of topics: leadership, education, philanthropy, impact investing, transitions into the social purpose sector. And I'd really encourage you to put questions in the chat as we go through it, and I'll come to as many of those questions as we can over the course of the conversation. But Michael, just to set things up, I'm wondering if you could tell us what has COVID meant for you and your family, and what does an average day look like for you at the moment?
Well, it's certainly a different world that we're living in post-COVID, Doug. I think, like a lot of people on this call, frequent communications via Zoom, missing very much the direct contact. We were having a highlights and learnings family reflection the other day about what we've learned and what we're looking forward to. And I said something that I thought I'd never say, which is I'm actually looking forward to getting on a plane again. As somebody who travels a reasonable amount in my day-to-day life, that's not words I thought I would ever utter. On the positive side, lots of chance, and I think the notion that while we can't have the direct physical and personal connection, we can have a spiritual connection. The ability and the opportunity to stay close to people through technology, I think, is being utilised in interesting and smart ways. And certainly for my part, there's a bit more reflective time. I've always loved to read, the opportunity to catch up on some reading and the indulgence of a bit of binge watching on Netflix with my wife of 30 years has been something we've both enjoyed. Feels a bit indulgent, but it's a cool thing to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. That's great. Thanks for those insights, Michael. So, Michael, I'm going to go back to the start. You grew up in Morwell, a regional town in Victoria, a town that's had its own fair of challenges that you describe in your book, and you were publicly educated. In fact, your dad was a school principal at some of your schools, and there's a whole backstory of that, I well imagine. And whilst at high school, you excelled in sport and academics as well. But I want to go to your primary school experience, because I think that had its challenges. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your experiences there.
As you reflected, Doug, yes, very much had an interesting background in what would be characterised, if you looked at the postcodes and heat maps of social disadvantage, more with a population of 17,000 where I grew up, would show up on such a map for the wrong reasons. It was a pretty mixed community, but my overwhelming memory is of a town where there was a sense of community, where there were schools, where there were kids from very different and eclectic backgrounds, but it had a tough side as well. And my primary school experience and my childhood experience was very much shaped by the privileged opportunity of growing up in a family where my parents loved each other. They loved my brother and I, and they were passionate about the opportunity that we should have to do our best. They felt very strongly in terms of values of education. Dad in particular, in his own very powerful way, was quite a role model. He was the first in 4 generations to go past year 10 at school. He, in fact, grew up in a town even smaller than Morwell, Maffra, population 4,000.
Right.
But I think for my brother and I, we very much felt that there was a light on the hill, that if you had a crack at school and you had a crack at education, doors would open up as they had for Dad. He was the only, he was one of 2 to go past year 10 at school in his own year. He, as a 15-year-old, arrived at the big smoke in Melbourne, went to Melbourne High School, studied at Melbourne University, and had a lifetime of commitment and passion for the public education system as a teacher and principal. So those values were very much imbued in us, and both Mum and Dad were deeply involved in community. I think also reflecting on that, and I talked about this in the book, like many people, my experiences at school were good, but they were mixed. There was a period of time which in hindsight was pretty defining, where I was bullied reasonably badly for a year or so. You know, on a scale of 0 to 10, it wasn't extreme. There wasn't so much physical bullying, but I think if you go through an experience like that, it gives you a deep and personal sense of what it's like to be another, like what it's like to be excluded. And I think those experiences are very shaping for the many of us, and I know there'll be many who are looking in on this Zoom who've had not dissimilar experiences. And I think that does touch and change you a little bit, and it certainly encourages you to grow up in life to want to engage more broadly in what you can around in the community. And as I reflected in Jumping Ship, you know, those defining experiences are really part of your DNA. It's that great Jesuit line, show me the young person at 7 and I'll show you the adult at 21. And I think there's a very deep truth in that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great insight, Michael. Look, I also grew up in a couple of small country towns in New South Wales, and I think it really shaped me and gave me insights into class and how society is structured. I'm wondering if you draw a line between your observations in Morwell and kind of into your career and your work in SVA around addressing disadvantage and what you saw in those early years.
Yeah, I think the experience at Morwell was really pivotal. It's fresh in mind. My brother and I were at a high school reunion a couple of years ago, and I think there was a real sense for both of us that, courtesy of the home background that I mentioned, we were given all sorts of opportunities, and we knew that if we had to go at school and there were enough, you know, there was enough quality of education and quality of teaching that we could do well, and we both in our own way, I guess did. But we're also deeply conscious that a lot of our peers at school didn't have the background and were let down in various and different ways, sometimes inadvertently by their families, sometimes by the school, and sometimes just that ugly coincidence of what Noel Pearson accurately calls the curse of low expectations, that for young people growing up in a community where they're not expected to achieve, guess what happens? You know, in significant part, they don't. And at that reunion, and there were a number of our peers who we just knew, you know, we knew these kids when they were in year 8, year 10, they were doing well in maths. You knew they had all sorts of opportunities, but in a lot of cases, their lives didn't open up to the education and further career pathways that you just knew that they had the capacity to do. So that kind of sticks with you. And as I reflected in the book, you know, courtesy of that education and opportunity, I had the opportunity to study at Melbourne University. I subsequently studied at the Harvard Business School and went to Macquarie Bank. But I always had that deep sense that over a long period of time, when you go back to a reunion like that, the fabric of community had changed, and it hadn't changed for the better. So this counterpoint of a society where over a generation of what had been pretty unprecedented globally economic growth, why the hell was my community not just not better, it was actually visibly and materially worse in terms of the socio-economic indicators of disadvantage and unemployment and exclusion. And for a country that I always felt prided itself on the notion of the fair go, you know, that kind of sticks in your guts.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'll come back to some further thoughts on education and social policy in relation to that. So I just want to go back to the period between university and Harvard. There's a thing I didn't know about you. which is that for a short stint you're a political advisor and being called on to advise leaders, including the then opposition leader Andrew Peacock. Tell us about that, and any regrets in not continuing on that pathway in terms of policy advice and political advice?
Well, interesting question. You know, I was one of those weird geeky kids, and again, I think Dad was a big influence in this. When I was in high school, my head was invariably stuck in politics books. I read it, although I confess I didn't understand it. It was an old dusty copy of Plato's Republic that Dad had from his university days. Slightly less pretentiously, I did read quite a lot of political biography, and I was fascinated with that. I was an unashamed hero of Edward Gough Whitlam. I have a vivid recollection of being completely overawed when, as a 14-year-old, he appeared as a speaker at the Morwell Town Hall, and I stood in a queue and I got to shake his hand. I was gutted when he was kicked out in 1975. And so politics was kind of in my blood. And I had an opportunity, somewhat bizarrely, and there's still a risk that I'll sound quite defensive about this, but I actually worked very much as a junior G-boy, I hasten to add, but for a year in the office of Andrew Peacock, who was the leader of the federal opposition. And it's worth reflecting briefly the story on that, and I'll leave people to make of it what they will. But the bizarre opportunity to work in his office came up through an old college contact of mine who worked as his personal assistant. And she called me out of the blue in 1984 when I was working at Eastman Kodak in a post-university industrial relations job that I enjoyed. I was learning, I was cutting my teeth. And she knew me pretty well. The 1984 election had been called. She called me out of the blue. Her name was Amanda Gubbins. And she said, "Traill, I know you're a card-carrying socialist, but they need somebody to work in the office for 8 weeks during the election. You've always loved politics. You know, why don't you put your hand into the ring?" And I thought, actually very thoughtful of her to think of me, but, you know, why the hell and how in good conscience could I work with somebody who I couldn't vote for? And anyway, fate intervened in the form of a guy who was a friend and mentor, and mentors have been a big, big part of my life. And I remember I came back into work the weekend after that conversation. His name was Rob Bright. And I told him about the conversation, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, this was really thoughtful of it to mention the opportunity, but I, you know, my politics, I'm kind of dyed-in-the-wool Labor." And he looked at me, he paused, and he said, "You're an idiot." And I said, what do you mean? And he said, "You're 24 years old. You've always been passionate and obsessed with politics, but you actually know nothing. You know, why don't you suspend your prejudices? If you get offered the job and you're prepared to give it a go, you might actually learn something." And that's stuck with me. And so the short of the longer story was that I did put my hat in the ring. I did get offered the role, and I finished up spending an incredibly interesting 12 months. And it taught me two things. One was, it was in the days of the old Parliament House, I unashamedly fell in love with Paul Keating. Keating was then an early treasurer and a courageous reformist. The other thing, which has been, I think, a motive in different ways for other things that I've done in my life that I reflected on in the book, is that you can actually learn a huge amount by being in the company of people who are thoughtful and smart and have a different view than what you do. And I actually learned an enormous amount from people whose ethics and philosophy might have been different to mine, but I actually learned a lot from them. And in many, many cases, I found I had way more in common with them than I thought I might otherwise. And that early opportunity to experience that environment was hugely beneficial. And I still get told by a range of people that I should look at going into politics for a range of reasons. I don't think I'm particularly well equipped to do that. And having had my 60th birthday a couple of months ago, that time has certainly passed. And if I took it up with my darling wife of 30 years and raised that as a prospect, it'd be a very brief conversation.
Well, I note the age of aspiring candidates in the US at the moment for the presidency. So there's still time, Michael. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, well, as an aside, dare I say, the age in some cases shows over there in terms of lack of judgment. There is a point where you're past your use-by date, mate.
That's very true. No, that's a salient lesson. Yeah. So, Michael, post that study at Harvard, you come back, you start working at Macquarie Bank, who you refer to as the millionaire's factory, or others refer to them. I think you quote that. Where you established the Macquarie Direct Investments, their private equity arm. Tell us about, for people who haven't worked in that sector, tell us a bit about that, because you were involved in some big deals with Miller Storage and Everpal Spring Water. Tell us about what excited you and energized you about that work so much.
I really had a great 15-year experience at Macquarie, and overwhelmingly it was a great and positive learning environment. There are some things that I'll come back to that I found somewhat more challenging, but the nature of the work I was involved in as a co-founder of the bank's original private equity business was investing in backing entrepreneurs. And I've always loved working with entrepreneurs. I love their energy. I love the fact that they get off their backsides and have a crack, and extremities of personality that go with that can have their challenges. But I just like the dynamism of people who've got a vision and the courage to make things happen and drive that. So our charter with Macquarie Direct Investment, and over that period we invested close to $500 million in 42 companies, was we would invest in amounts of generally $5 to $25 million. I started in that business when I was 30, so I had the great privilege and learning experience from that very early age of being on the boards of those businesses and trying to make a contribution to them, but also inevitably learning how to make the hard judgments when things weren't working and making the consequent tough decisions around changing personnel or changing CEOs, whether or not to put more money into those businesses. So I really enjoyed that. I think, as somebody who's always been a student, I don't think that ever goes away. The opportunity to work in that proximity with entrepreneurs and to work at Macquarie itself, you know, I talked about the significance of mentors and influences in my life. David Clark, who hired me, was a founding executive chairman of Macquarie, just a marvellous Renaissance man who conducted business with a great sense of ethics, who had deep engagements in the broader community. So through him, other leaders and founders at the bank, and through the CEOs that I got to work with, just a fabulous learning experience and an opportunity up close and personal to, at those early formative days of my own building experience, to watch what people did, what worked, what didn't, what made for great leaders, what got in the road, and to try and draw my own conclusions as I got different opportunities to put my own stamp in things about trying to define my own mode of operation. But it was really a class and an opportunity to learn from the best. It was fantastic.
That's great. There's a couple of great questions in the chat box, and one of them I'm going to come back to, which is about the kind of future economic model for our society that would be more equitable. But another one too, which relates to my next question. So what you talk about in your book is that people underestimate the values that you saw with a lot of people at Macquarie Bank and in that sector, notwithstanding the behaviours that you talk about that you saw sometimes at bonus time, which perhaps were less desirable. So I want to think about the Banking Royal Commission. It was primarily about retail banking, but it did have some things to say about investment banking. How do you feel about your former profession in light of what you saw through the Banking Royal Commission? And do you think that more needed to be done in reform?
So two things. I think, and there's a risk I'll sound defensive about this because I had just such a positive experience at Macquarie, but I do think if you actually go back to the front end of Macquarie, the idea that a business can be run with a sound ethical framework, and a lot of businesses do, some don't, and I'll come back to that out of the Royal Commission, but from the get-go, courtesy of the founding leadership of David Clark, Tony Berg, who was the founding CEO, Robin Crawford, who was the founding director, they did something very early in the life of Macquarie that was quite defining. They went away for a weekend. And I can tell you, I know that market pretty well. Not many investment banks either do this or take it seriously. When the bank was 2 years old, it was a year or two before my time. And they said, what will we stand for? what are our ethics and values? And I know, because I've talked to a bunch of people like David Clark and Robin Crawford, how did that work? And they said, universally, actually there was a bit of cynicism about it, but David and Tony were insistent that we needed to do that this would define how we operated. And I having worked closely with people like Tony and David, Shamara Wickramanayake, who's the current CEO, I started with, and she sat about 10 feet from me. Shamara is a close personal friend, and I mention her because she is a great example of the seeds that were planted in that goals and values statement from 1986. Shamara's been there from 1987. I know her well. She's an outstanding leader. She's deeply principled. And if you go back to the source DNA of the bank, David insisted on a foundation. That has now given away over $250 million. When I joined the bank, it was tattooed into your brain that there needed to be a set of ethics in which you did deals. So David used to call it the page 3 financial review test. Don't do anything. Don't do anything if you would be uncomfortable if that was talked about on page 3 of the financial review. And it's a pretty decent test of what's right and what's wrong. And so back to the Royal Commission, how do I see that profession now, or more broadly? There's no question that there are some organisations have lost their way, and I think that's generally been a combination of two things. One is it's mostly organisations who don't have a set of foundational principles and values. The combination of that with leadership is just critical. So you can have, and we've all seen the value statements and goals and values, if they're not put into practice, if they're not practiced and believed, and there aren't endless examples of CEO, board, senior team practicing that, then things can collapse pretty quickly. And the Royal Commission in many instances provided a scarifying example of how quickly things can go wrong where you don't have a combination of a genuine commitment to values which are both widely understood and leaders who are authentic leaders and commit to those and practice those.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for the questions in the chat. There's some great ones which we're coming to now around impact investing and mentoring, and we'll certainly come back to kind of future of our economy. So I want to come to the heart of your book, jumping off, which is really relates to a young chap called Pattis, who's in your son's Aussie Rules team. Tell me how he signified a significant change in your life, Michael.
Well, Pattis chapter 1 and is the epilogue of the book for very powerful reasons. And one of the great joys that I've inherited from Dad is a love of sport, a love of engagement with the kids through coaching their footy teams. I'm an unreconstructed AFL addict, and when we moved to Sydney, I was very proud to be the coach of that very underrated force in the North Shore Junior AFL League, the Willoughby Wildcats, in which my son Christopher played in the under-12s. And it was at a period where I'd been at the bank for about 12 or 13 years, and there was an epiphany moment one weekend where I was coaching the footy team, but we're also due to go on Monday to our board for an investment approval for a $20 million transaction. I had a vivid recollection, and the book opens with this story about waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning, Sunday morning. The Wildcats had a game on, and normally in that environment, I'd be thinking about, God, we've got all this homework we have to do on this deal. We're due to go to the investment committee the next day, but wasn't what I was thinking about. I was thinking about a young boy in the side called Pattis, who was a cracker kid, super quality athlete. But I knew from his dad, and I think from a quick scan, Tim might even be on this Zoom. So great to e-connect if you are, Tim. But Pattis had a few challenges at school, and I knew that he'd gone missing. He was quiet for a couple of games. So I'm thinking, if I move Pattis to full forward or make him captain for the day, maybe that'll get him fired up again. And that moment caused a bit of an epiphany for me, which was actually, I really enjoy coaching the kids, but the idea that in some small way I might be able to have a positive influence on a boy who has some challenges, if he can if I can do something that lifts his confidence, because he was just a cracker athlete, that makes me feel that I'm doing something really, really constructive. Not that I was feeling negative about the bank, but the fact that I woke up obsessing about how can I make a difference to the footy team, how can I make a difference potentially to Patty, was one of those defining moments that took me back to your earlier question about Morwell, which is what else can I do? What else can I do? And in language that I now use that captured that moment more eloquently than I could have then. And if I scan the list, there's another great mentor in my life, Norman Drummond, and his son Drew. And if you're online, Norman, particular thanks, because Norman's patching in from Edinburgh, where it's about 6:30 in the morning.
Fantastic.
Norman's been a great influence in my life in many ways. Norman has this idea that we should be asking ourselves three fundamental questions that at one level are simple, at another level deeply profound. And the first question is, who are you? You've asked me that, and I've shared that openly around the background in Morwell. The second question is, why are you living and working the way you currently are? Why are you living and working the way you currently are? And that really goes to where I was at that weekend. I was actually, although I didn't realise at the time, at the back end of a career at Macquarie where I'd done well personally, professionally and financially. But I was kind of done. The learning curve had flattened. In language that Norman would use, if we're human beings and we're programmed to fire on 8 cylinders, I felt like I was only using about 5 or 6 cylinders, is the truth. And what the Patty experience captured for me was the need for me to ask what Norman calls his question 3, which is, what might you yet become and do with the rest of your life? And so that question of what I might do, or were there a set of more specifically skills or things that I'd learned in the privileged opportunity I'd had at Harvard and at Macquarie and in the background I'd had, were the things that I could do that would utilise those business and private equity skills, hopefully in some sort of constructive way that would make a difference in backing social entrepreneurs rather than business entrepreneurs, people who could actually make a difference to the fabric of community and potentially to the fabric of the community which I grew up in Morwell, which had pretty clearly broken down in so many ways. So long answer to your question, but as I reflected in the book, it was a weekend of both deep personal introspection and ultimately really quite transformational.
And thanks for mentioning Norman too. I remember the early days of SVA, Norman speaking at a number of your functions, very inspiring. And so clearly mentoring's been important to you, mentoring others and being mentored. And so there's a question there in the chat box from Daniel in terms of mentoring. How have you found and established those relationships? How do you get into those sort of mentoring where you're being mentored?
I think that question around mentors is such an important one. I mean, I know Norman has this idea of trusted friends, and I think that's so important, certainly for me as I reflect on that. And I have a characterisation of what I call situational mentors. I'm in the privileged position of having people who I feel like I can go to. I can be incredibly open with them about issues or challenges that I'm facing. And as I reflect on that, the common denominator is I want to go to people who've had the lived experience of what I'm dealing with, and particularly in leadership positions. I don't want to sound cynical, but the idea of people who are consultants or coaches who haven't had the lived experience, I find of less utility. I want to be listening to the scar tissue and lived experience. You know, I'll never forget talking to my great friend and colleague, Jan Owen, at a point where we had a deep funding crisis. And she'd been through a similar thing in an organisation she'd founded at Create 15 years earlier. You know, there's nothing like the comfort, solace, but most importantly, practical advice you can get from somebody. Jan had been through that. So to have the conversation with her about that, or when I talked to Norman on a similar issue in the wonderful organisation he built, which has now gone global, Columba 1400, he had that lived experience of facing a literally existential financial position. So there's no substitute for that. And I'm unashamed in using that, and I feel deeply privileged to have access to people. I think it's worth flipping that question too, because now I'm approaching my geriatric years. I'm in the privileged position where I do get asked to be on the other side of that equation. And I was asked a question when I was doing the book launch, which was a really interesting one that picks up on your theme, Doug, and it was a good question. It was, you clearly had a lot of people who've been incredibly influential and important to you as mentors. And the question was this: what does it take to be a good mentee? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really good question. And as my children are in their 20s, I've encouraged them to think about that. And the answer, I think, is a combination of actually pretty simple things. And I see now that I've had some first-person experience, I guess, of being on the other side of the fence, there's simple things that not many people do well. And it's these common things. One is that you actually make an effort and take the time to share what you're doing. Most people actually don't think they can have those conversations that they can. And then the second is that make an effort to show your appreciation that actually you valued the conversation and that it's made a difference to what you do. And in my experience, frankly, 95% of the time, that doesn't actually happen. Mm. And the third thing is, one of the great joys about being involved in those conversations, I see them very much as a two-way street. There's a part of me that feels a discomfort with the mentor-mentee thing. You know, one of the great privileges for me is, I call them co-coaching conversations. It's very unusual for me, and I'll give a great practical example. He's not much more than half my age. Jack Manning-Bancroft, who founded Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience, which is just a fabulous program that SVA supported. That's an incredibly empowering program for young Indigenous people. Jack Manning-Bancroft, who founded that, is an extraordinary Gen X entrepreneur. And Jack being Jack, he's an excellent mentee, but he's actually a fabulous mentor. Mm-hmm. And I talked about this in the book, you know, conversation after conversation I'd have with him where I'd go in there, and Jack had set it up as me being some sort of voice of experience and wisdom. Every time I came away from that conversation thinking, God, Jack is doing so much with AIM in terms of their culture and their values. And he's giving to me just a fabulous example of what I should be doing at SVA in terms of leadership, including 2 or 3 practical things of things that I could put in place at SVA. You know, so the gift of these opportunities is that they're very much a two-way street.
Thanks, Michael. So I want to come to your time at SVA. That's obviously a significant part of your career. You said that when you landed the role as founding CEO, what you knew about the not-for-profit sector, you put on a postage stamp. So there was a lot to learn. I'm interested in how your transition in terms of your way of leading from a corporate environment to a social purpose context. Tell us about that transition and what you learned in that process.
It was quite a transition, and I was extremely nervous, which I talked about in the book about, and that wasn't, there's no false humility in that statement. What I knew about the non-profit sector would have comfortably fitted it on a postage stamp on February the 4th, 2002, the day that I started at SVA. One of the common denominators across both sectors that is relevant, and I rate, is humble leadership, the idea that we need to listen and learn. And I think the significance of that in the social purpose world is multiplied by a factor of about 3 to 5 times. There was a great bit of early advice I was given by somebody who'd walked the talk in both sectors pretty effectively. And he said, Michael, you have to understand, every time you walk into a non-profit audience, people are seeing some tosser from the Millionaire's factory who's putting on a hair shirt and wants to do good. Don't kid yourself. And his line, which I always remember, was just remember that they are effectively saying, we don't care what you know until we know that you care. We don't care what you know until we know that you care. And I thought there was deep wisdom in that. And it meant, and I think, certainly a sustaining SVA value, that we need to walk in the footsteps of those who are making a difference. We need to be really thoughtful, empathetic, understanding. We need to understand the people and the programs. And until we've done that at a level of depth, at a level of humility and integrity, however smart or useful we think our strategy or our funding will be, it won't be accepted in the same way. And I think that's heavily true. And I don't think, and I think, so the idea that in the sector, the idea of building relationships of trust, of being prepared and open to listen, I think is quite, I think is subtly but significantly different. The second significant difference that I find, and I get asked quite a bit, is, you know, what do you think the principal differences between the two sectors are? I think, and this will be received knowledge, this is, just from a quick scan of the people on this call, there are many who've got a real depth of experience in the social purpose world. I think the challenge of scaling and repeating things that work in the social purpose sector is much more nuanced, much more difficult and much more complicated than it is in the business world. You know, the truth is a lot of the 42 investments that we did, I use the example of retail a lot. So we're investors in JB Hi-Fi, the Reject Shop, Miller's Fashion Club. They could scale and repeat their operating models relatively effectively. The challenge of repeating effective programs in the social purpose world has to have much deeper regard to local engagement, community engagement and leadership. And the related challenge is the idea of measuring what works and what doesn't is, I think of it as a three-dimensional problem in the social purpose world, whereas in my life at Macquarie, for the most part, understanding P&L and balance sheet, that's kind of two-dimensional. You know, you generally, you know pretty quickly, you can get your head around cash flow metrics and whether a business is performing profit-wise, but there's a depth that's required and a level of homework and understanding that's required to get to meaningful measurement of social purpose indicators. So those two things I think are significantly, subtly, but significantly different.
Thanks, Michael. Great insights. That said, I don't remember the hair shirt, you pulling that out, but perhaps you did in particular forums. Look, I mean, at SVA, you're a trailblazer on a number of fronts, and it was a lot of it was in relation to funding, new funding models, new ways of working. Couple of questions there in the chat box related to impact investing, and you are very much on the ground floor of that in Australia and seeing that come into our context. And I just note that, you know, my organisation, Uniting, was the first recipient of a bond in Australia for the new PIN program, and SVA were a really critical partner in getting that up off the ground. And I think we've all learned a lot through that experience. Now, last year, appointed by the PM to lead a social impact investing task force. Can you tell us, based on all your experience with impact investing, what's your vision for that task force? And what do you see as the role now of impact investing as we mature in our thinking, given that it's the not-for-profit sector is a $120 billion sector? So what's the role of impact investing in that large sector?
Yeah, so look, the opportunity with the Social Impact Investing Task Force is really exciting. And I do think, as many on this Zoom call will know, the challenge of getting government to engage and do things can be a bit of a mixed grill, but there's a genuine leadership enthusiasm for that. And the opportunity, to your question, Doug, I think is a hugely significant one. So the picture that I paint, I think of it as the capacity actually for a capitalism 2.0. The idea that if you look at and I'll come back to some of the other opportunities, but particularly at the larger scale, one of the hats I've worn in the last 5 years, I'm on the board and chair the investment committee of Sun Super, which is a $70 billion superannuation fund. This country has $3 trillion in superannuation. Now, if you liberate just a 2% chunk of that, we'd have $60 billion to invest in high quality, large scale social purpose organisations. The poster child for that in a way has become Good Start, which obviously SVA and others were closely involved in, and which it's been my great privilege to chair. Good Start itself is $1 billion social purpose organisation in a competitive market. It's done well because it's done a really good job of quality, but in the process, it's generated very decent, sustainable financial returns to investors. So part of the hypothesis on the task force is that we have this market opportunity to run large-scale, ethical, purpose-focused businesses that can also generate reasonable financial returns. What the task force also talks about, and there's an interim report we've produced, which I'd highly recommend, and we're very interested in feedback on, is that if you look at, and you mentioned, for example, the social benefit bonds. So SVA was the pioneer in those with Uniting Care. I think there's a huge opportunity to access funding where it's very clear that that funding can be repaid based on achievement of outcome metrics. There's a heap of work that's been done in the UK in scaling and growing that. So it's very much about supporting high quality organisations that are making a difference. And we need to think about how we can replicate that and how we can grow that. And so the picture that you see in the task force is that with appropriate government support, can we set up thoughtful, sustainable institutions? And for those who've got familiarity with the precedents that exist globally, there's a fabulous light on the hill, really, that has come out of the work of Sir Ron Cohen in the UK, who did a similar task force in 2002. And you look at the many footprints left by his original work, Big Society Capital, which is a £400 million wholesaler and intermediary. It's changed the market. There's a whole series of things that have happened around outcome funds. Our hope is with the work of the task force to get up a series of recommendations that can replicate that. So yeah, I think there's a really exciting and transformational opportunity. And to go back to your original question, Doug, I do actually think in a COVID environment, people are thinking a bit more seriously about the nature of the community and the nature of the economy that we want to live in. You know, it sounds pretty cliched, but including from some unlikely governments, everybody's a Keynesian now. Yeah. Now, what that means is, I think we get and accept that when the community is struggling, there's a role for thoughtful provision of capital to protect the quality of our existence as human beings. And so the idea that there are these big chunks of capital in the system that can be mobilised for both ethical financial returns and good, I always thought it was compelling as soon as we started at SVA, but the case now is massively more compelling, and we've just got to find smart ways of liberating those pools of funds. So I'm an optimist on that. As I say, big lesson to me over the last 5 years, having been inside that super fund industry. We've got pioneers like Hester, which is a major fund, First State. They're starting to do things. So at a leadership board level, I can provide some assurance to the group listening that there's a will to do this. We've just got to find ways to originate and generate those transactions and create a better enabling environment.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. There were some questions about thinking about the economic shifts required in light of COVID. So that's helpful. So I want to come to some of your other current philanthropic endeavours. So you're the chair of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which was established by the request, a $3 billion request by the late Paul Ramsay. And you were about to launch the new strategy for the foundation, and COVID hit. Can you tell us about how the crisis has impacted the long-term and short-term priorities in terms of the foundation and its work going forward?
Yeah, so the Paul Ramsay Foundation, what an extraordinary opportunity and gift to the nation it was. So Paul Ramsay founded Ramsay Healthcare. When he passed away a bit over 5 years ago, he left virtually all of his own equity ownership, which was over 30% of the business. That turns out to have been worth about $4 billion. On a per head basis in Australia, that's actually bigger than the Gates Foundation in the US. So just remarkable. And we really want to try and do that thoughtfully and strategically. We've got a fabulous CEO, Glenn Davis, who, for those who don't know, Glenn did an extraordinary job at Melbourne University, highly, highly respected policy and politics advisor, and we've now got a fabulous team to do that. So to your point, Doug, and we're very much living in that. There was a strategy that we were due to launch. It's really with an explicit focus on how can we work in partnership to address issues of entrenched and systemic disadvantage in Australia. There's the throw weight and the capital to do that, hopefully really thoughtfully, really strategically. So we'll continue to do that work, but there was a very conscious sense that we needed to respond to the urgency and the existential threat that a lot of our partners are facing in the COVID crisis. So topical, we have a series of work groups who've got a really good quality board who get closely involved with the foundation's work. So as for example of that, we've got a COVID subcommittee that's looking specifically at how do we work more closely with partners to make sure that they have the capacity and funding access. The government, I think, to its great credit, has liberated some pretty significant pools of funding. So often it's working with government to make sure that social purpose organisations can not just survive, but continue to perform work that's at a greater need than it probably has been for a couple of generations. And we need to pivot around that. We've made a commitment, which we've gone public about. One of our concerns is that, yes, valuations in the public equity markets are off 20%, but that's really no excuse for not continuing at the least the level of philanthropic commitment. And we've been working with government. There was an announcement from the Minister for Charities yesterday, and Glyn Davis was quoted in that reinforcing how important it is for those in a position to give, to do so generously, to consider giving not just at previous levels, but higher levels through this period of obvious need. So I think it's incumbent on any thoughtful strategic philanthropy organisation to pivot. And I've seen all sorts of examples locally and globally. I'm a big believer in the generosity of spirit of people and those who can afford to do something to step up to the plate in that. And while it was a crisis of a different and I think very lesser order now, you know, I know during the GFC, I was very gratified that our many supporters really stuck with us during that period of 2008 and 2009. And it's very clear this COVID issue is a once in multi-generation challenge. So hopefully people will respond to that in the right way. We certainly feel we have to at Ramsay, given the leadership position of the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Look, we've got about 8 minutes left, and there's so much more we could ask you, Michael. And I think we do have to come to Good Start, such a significant part of the early learning landscape in Australia today. An amazing partnership that you pulled together. So in your book, you talk about the kind of that day you got a call from Evan Thornley that led to the creation of Good Start from the ashes of ABC Learning. Can you tell us about really, I guess not sort of the mechanics and detail of how it came together, but what it took from you to actually pull that disparate group of people together to stitch up that deal? Because it was a very diverse group. What did it take from you to kind of pull that together and then make it stick into what became an incredible outcome for Australia?
It's a very good question. And actually, one of the main motives for writing the book was to share as openly as I could the story of Good Start and how it happened, on the basis that I thought it was entirely repeatable, and I still absolutely believe that. And that ability to get partners together goes back to an earlier question you asked. If you work in a spirit of integrity and humility and partnership, it's amazing what you can get achieved. So what sat behind that was the ability of 4 non-profits, and again, many on this call will be aware. If you talk about Benevolent Society, country's oldest charity, founded in New South Wales in the early 1800s, Brotherhood of St Lawrence, organisation with a proud history of advocacy in Victoria and social justice, Mission Australia, a large provider of employment services, and SVA. But at a superficial level, at least, all of those 4 organisations, politically, ideologically, in terms of their service focus, quite different, like incredibly different is the truth.
Yeah.
But the light on the hill was that comment of Evans, which is, this is a once in a generation opportunity to transition the landscape, change the country in terms of how it looks at early learning. And what happened was that light on the hill statement motivated all of those boards, but particularly the CEOs. And I can't speak too highly of all of that CEO group, all of whom contributed enormously personally and professionally, but all of whom actually brought quite complementary skills. And again, in the book, I tease out the fact that it was the combination of, I think, an ego-free zone. I'll never forget Tony Nicholson, who's now on the Good Start board, taking the lead in negotiating with government, and he was terrific at that. And I was a complete Gumby at that. There are other skills that I could bring in terms of the structure of the deal and my private equity background, our ability to engage really high quality professional services firms, Gilbert and Tobin, National Australia Bank. And so I think that spirit of one-on-one, one by one, and then in partnership, which is a great line of Norman Drummond's, that idea of one-on-one, one by one, and then in partnership, you'll be surprised at what you can achieve. but
Yeah.
particularly that notion of partnership across the sectors on the back of a really clear message about what good looked like. The other thing, and again, many on this call will have similar experiences. Frankly, I've been in too many feel-good committees where there's an idea and you go to a committee meeting and it's an idea to do something, you meet once a month and then the minutes come out and you meet in another 2 months and the minutes come out. The difference in what made Good Start happen was that there was real energy and momentum, and my great friend and mentor, Robin Crawford, was certainly first amongst equals on that. But there was a small handful of people who spent a lot of their waking hours wanting to make it happen with a bias for action to actually get it done. And so I think it's the combination of the depth of the partnerships, the clarity of the light on the hill statement, but the actual ownership that, you know, people, you could look in the whites of people's eyes and know who was accountable to make it happen with the three common denominators. And I think they're entirely achievable and repeatable in trying to originate more of those sorts of opportunities. As you will reflect at Uniting Care, all of those dynamics were at play in doing the country's first social benefit bonds. I had a recent conversation with your then National CEO, Lynn Hatfield-Dodds, who was remarkable, because I know she had a bunch of people in the sector saying, what are you doing? You know, this is some investment banker tosses ideas, slick willy, social benefit bonds. What the hell is that? It's ripping off government. It's not doing any good. Well, she backed it and she believed it.
Yeah, fantastic, Michael. We're running out of time, Michael, and I've been trying to bring some of the chat questions into what we've been talking about, but a couple of rapid fire responses in the 3 minutes we've got left, if we can. There's a lot of great questions. Great question from Robin about how do we encourage more for-purpose leaders in rural communities? Any insights given your lived experience there too?
I think we need to do a lot more on that. For what it's worth, it's a big topic of conversation at Ramsay. I'm staggered that there's not more explicit training and leadership development for people who have those community building skills. I think it's a really underdone area. So, you know, tick, area of great need and opportunity. I'm surprised there's not a bit more formality and structure in how we go about that. And we see that as a flashing area of need at Ramsay.
There's another question here too in relation to the way that public education and teachers have been viewed throughout COVID, in kind of with a sense that it's been negative. What's your observation about that in this context?
It's a very tricky space. That the whole attendance, not attendance at school, I think has had some pretty unfortunate consequences around that. I'm unashamedly biased given my background and Dad's background, the ethic and commitment of teachers, and particularly in the public sector, I think is just extraordinary. And anybody who's been close to that will know how hard they've, in many cases, had to work additionally hard because of the challenge of providing high quality on learning. So I think there's a much broader issue around the currency and credibility of teaching. Sadly, I think it's been eroded over the last 30 years, and we really need to recognise, re-establish the importance of that as a profession, the value of that and the respect and regard we have for teachers.
Great. And just a question and maybe a response in a line. You know, you talk about the influence of the kind of mantras from your father, the give it a go. Norman Drummond talks about the kind of bringing the head and the heart together. There's a question from Aditi about advice for young people starting their career. What would be your kind of throwaway line in giving people that advice as they start?
It's a mix of two things. And I always start any conversation with a young person by saying, I'm happy to share my experience. I try and avoid giving gratuitous advice. There's a risk I'll cross the boundary in that in what I'm about to say. One is my experience, and that Andrew Peacock story is illustrative. Don't be shy of having a crack at a learning experience that might look quite different. You might be pleasantly surprised at what you'll get out of it. And the second thing is, I do think that idea of, in Norman's great words, connecting head and heart, you know, you've got to ask yourself that question. And I do think his 3-question framework, the who are you, why are you living and working the way you currently are, what might you yet become and do with the rest of your life. I'm staggered at the number of people in their 20s who actually are doing that quite consistently in their own way. I'm equally staggered and saddened by the number of people often stuck in pretty tedious but very well paid professional services jobs in their 50s who don't ask themselves that question. And I very quickly, I quote in the book an example of, using those lines at a major speaking engagement I had, and a table of CEOs surreptitiously taking down those questions, which tells you two things. One is they don't have the humility to acknowledge that. Two, they hadn't asked themselves the bloody questions.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thank you, Michael. Look, thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for your leadership on so many fronts. You inspire many of us, and we greatly appreciate all you've done. And I encourage everyone else to do themselves a favour and to have a read of the book. It's terrific. And I'm going to hand back to Rhonda. Thanks again, Michael, and everyone for your participation.
Thanks so much, Doug. Great to talk with you. And thanks for the shameless book plug too.
Here, I'll give it another one. I just got mine. I think I got it from Booktopia. Thanks so much to Doug and Michael. That was really interesting. I shouldn't say it, but one of my favourites so far. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And we'll end the meeting now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.